Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today we have another installment in the disability education series of the show. I am Katie Ott, and I have my doctorate in occupational therapy, which makes me qualified to discuss diagnoses and symptomology and its functional impact that those things might have on our participants. I'm also a Path International CTRI, so we're going to tie this all together with horsemanship skills and how it impacts mounted activities too. We've done quite a few other ones in the disability education series, like Down syndrome and CP, ADHD, there's a couple other ones. So if you're interested in that disability education and you're a member of Patreon, head over there because I just posted the full list of all those episodes with the links to them. So you can thumb through those and get the disability education that you really want. Like I said, I always try to tie these diagnoses and the symptoms back to how they functionally impact our participants in the saddle. So, how can we help? How can we be prepared to help? Overall, just how do we partner with our horses for our participants to be the most safe and successful, number one, and number two, have a ton of fun. So, let's get into it. Today, we are going to look at tone. Everyone's heard of it. High tone, low tone, fluctuating tone, spasticity. What does all of this even mean? Spoiler alert, it can be a little complicated, and depending on the diagnosis, it can look really different from participant to participant. So, we're going to break down the basic differences in muscle tone in this episode. But if you're interested in the more complicated versions, like fluctuating tone when it ranges from low or high within the same person, or dystonia where it's like that writhing sort of involuntary rhythmic movement, I'm going to refer you over to episode 53. I'll put the link in the show notes. And that episode was about cerebral palsy. So I covered a lot of that more complex tone information in detail there because those motor patterns can be a common part of the diagnosis cerebral palsy. So um, after you listen to this, if you're here for the nuts and bolts of muscle tone, you're going to listen to this episode and then maybe click over to episode 53 for some more detail. So let's get into it. Muscle tone at its very basic level is that it's the amount of tension in a relaxed muscle. Every single person listening right now has muscle tone. Just the amount of tone that your muscle has while we're sitting here relaxed. So it's complex and it's dynamic. I mean, it's regulated by both input to the brain as well as output from the brain, obviously. So if we look at it a little more in detail, muscle tone requires the brain to register input, i.e., if I'm starting to lose my balance, the brain senses that information, so that input to the brain, and then produce an output. So if I'm losing my balance, my brain senses that, the input, and then creates the output, which is turns the muscles on to increase the tone and keep me on my feet or keep the balance. So the middleman in this whole operation is the spinal cord, and that's, the information highway coming and going from the brain to the rest of the body. And then we have the end of the chain or the beginning of the chain, which is the muscle spindles and nerves and such that lie within the muscle to actually do the sensing and the contracting and the job within the muscle. So at rest, obviously we know that our body has some level of resting tone, otherwise we would all fall out of our chairs. Dysfunction occurs in the information highway we just discussed at different levels. So differences or difficulty with managing muscle tone, generally speaking, happens somewhere in that information highway. There are some outliers that are associated with CP, but like I said, you can head over to episode 53 if you want more of that information. But, at the basic nuts and bolts, muscle tone difficulty could start in the brain, like a stroke, TBI, somewhere where the brain is damaged, or it could be somewhere along the spinal cord, right? That information highway, something like a spinal cord injury, things like that. Or it could be at the end point, like a severe cut or crush injury to an arm or leg, something like that, where those nerves are actually disrupted. So, we're going to examine some differences in tone that are common and what diagnoses may be associated with that, and what it means for our participants and horses. I wanted you guys to understand sort of the the behind the scenes of muscle tone and how that applies going forward when we talk about symptoms. So if you listen to my other disability education episodes, you know I love a good medical terminology moment. So tone, tonia. Anytime you hear the word tonia, we're referring to muscle tone. Pretty easy, right? So hyper, hypo, hyper, like when you call your kids hyper when they have excess energy. Well, hyper means a lot or too much. So hypertonia is too much tone. In contrast to that, hypo means not enough or very little. So hypotonia means not enough tone or low tone as you put those words all together. So we'll talk about each of these in their own segments, but let's talk about hypertonia first. So that's too much tone, and that's characterized by stiff, tight muscles, typically in conditions that impact the central nervous system, like the brain and spinal cord. Diagnoses such as MS, stroke, CP, TBI, spinal cord injury, all those folks could experience hypertonia. And it could look like a variety of things. It most often impacts the extremities, like maybe a tightly folded in arm with curled fingers or extended ankles, that pointed toe sort of rigidity that we've seen in some of our participants. But it can affect the whole body. So the trunk, everything. So, as with every disability we talk about, it looks different for each person. So, we'll talk about kind of a few different versions, I guess, of hypertonia. Spasms are pretty easily explained, right? So those quick contractions of the muscles, almost twitching sometimes, that can be a classification of hypertonia. Clonus, which are rhythmic contractions of the muscle. So usually they're the larger muscle groups. Then spasms, and they have like an increased velocity. So a lot of time you'll see clonus with movement. The more a person tries to move purposefully and manage those muscles, for a purposeful movement, the more sort of muscle bouncing or clonus that you might see. And then there's contracture, which is when the muscle is more frozen in a position. And that might look like that curled arm we talked about earlier. And it could be rigid depending on how that person stretches or uses that arm. So it could be rigid, like it truly feels stuck. Or it may be more flexible, like the arm, may rest in that position passively, right? That muscle is very tight at the rest, but it's possible to move it through some type of range of motion, or that person can actively move it, with those extensor muscles, the opposite muscles than the flexion muscles, at least a little bit. So it can kind of look both ways. Hypertonia can cause a whole host of issues, like secondary issues for our participants. It can be super painful, especially when that tone causes abnormal posture or even pressure sores. So, like if that participant were weighted to one hip or the other all the time and they never shifted their weight off of that hip because of the way that tone is impacting their trunk, that could cause a sore on the underside of their bottom or their pelvis or their leg, especially if they're in wheelchairs where they don't move as often, right? So we have to be aware of that. It can also cause permanent skeletal deformity. So if that tone is really high and it turns into a rigid contracture, physicians can actually start to see skeletal changes. For example, like curvature of the spine, scoliosis from high muscle tone in the core trunk and like the muscles that support the spine. So we can actually see some long-term, deformity from that. So how do we avoid secondary issues? Many of our participants with hypertonia are in PT, OT services to help with that functional mobility and strength. They come to our horseback riding lessons, right? Or they come do hippotherapy. All that can be really helpful. Many times, those participants may also have braces or even casting, like full casting, to help those joints stay in a more functional position and avoid that contracture where it gets really stuck and rigid. Most often, you're probably thinking of like an AFO that helps keep the ankle in a functional position. We'll talk about those a little bit later here too. Participants with hypertonia may also take oral medications or do injectable medication like Botox. So the same stuff people put in their forehead to prevent wrinkles. People who have hypertonia might use Botox for large muscle groups that are really tight because that's how Botox works, right? It's the injectable medication that basically deadens the muscle, right? So it's really making that muscle weak so that it can't create wrinkles, or so that we don't have hypertonic muscles and we can be a little bit more functional. But be aware if your participant does do regular Botox injections that it's going to help those muscle groups relax. And I mean, sometimes really relaxed. So you might see, that next session with you riding after they have a Botox treatment. You may see a huge improvement in their position in the saddle, or they, may struggle a little bit more because those muscles are changing and experiencing quite a significant impact from that medication. Those Botox treatment, usually last around 3 months or so. So it is something they have to do pretty consistently. Come join us in Gretna, Nebraska for a hands-on EAS workshop March 13th through the 15th in 2025. As the EAS industry continues to expand and diversify, it is of utmost importance to keep the needs of our equine partners a priority. At our workshop, get a comprehensive look at all the aspects of successful equine welfare, including appropriate equine selection, proper training, conditioning, and integration into programming, learn how to do practical saddle fit for EAS, set weight limits for your horses, and so much more. Equine welfare strategies are hard to learn while sitting in a desk at a regular conference. We believe in the power of hands-on practice with equine skills in a collaborative environment where we can learn from each other. Attendees should expect a combination of valuable hands-on experience with our horses, classroom-based education, and individualized coaching to help solidify the workshop content. Get the entire 2.5 days of content for just $125 with our early bird registration discount available till January 1st. Discounts are available for audit-only positions as well as scholarship opportunities. If you're a member of our exclusive club at Patreon, make sure to use your additional $25 discount code. To register and get all the details, head over to hetrauniversity.org or click the link in the show notes below. We hope to see you in Gretna this March. Let's shift gears. So speaking of very relaxed, we know kind of the opposite side of the coin of hypertonia is the hypotonia or low tone. I think it's kind of a cringy word, but it is used a lot, especially in infants. The floppy term, so floppy infants or ragdoll infants, sometimes is associated with hypotonia, especially if it's present at birth. And what causes hypotonia is pretty varied. So like I said, it could be at birth due to a number of genetic differences like Down syndrome, something like that, muscular dystrophy. It could be from like a brain insult or abnormality like stroke, TBI. You think about one side of the body having, decreased tone, that kind of a thing. Spinal cord injury, even things like infection or drug exposure or traumatic event can cause hypotonia. And obviously, it ranges from mild, so like what we would consider just poor muscle strength, like someone might come to you with kind of global hypotonia in their whole body, to the opposite end of the spectrum, which would be like completely flaccid, so no muscle tone at all, which is kind of a whole different ball game. But secondary issues for people with hypotonia could include things like delays in gross motor and fine motor development, which is also true of hypertonia, but we most often see that with a hypotonia diagnosis. You'll see that come across because they have difficulty walking and manipulating and using their fingers and things because of that low strength. Hyperflexibility is a thing for hypotonia. Speech and feeding difficulties, decreased activity endurance, and impaired posture, which can also lead to pressure sores and that kind of a thing, which we talked about with hypertonia as well. The treatment is also really similar to hypertonicity, except they're working on the opposite end of the spectrum, right? So PT, OT, strength training to just help improve that muscle tone and help them get stronger is what we're looking at there. Participants with low tone may also use braces or mobility equipment like wheelchairs and walkers, because of that difficulty with muscle tone and being able to move their body in a way that's functional, so that they can get around. So, what does this all mean? Right? What does this mean for us in the arena? If you have a participant come in and you do an evaluation with either one of these, increased tone or decreased tone, there's going to be quite a few areas that we really need to consider when we start looking at mounted activity. So, let's see. Let's just break this down into some different areas. How about good old ambulation? So just walking around, okay? If the tone impacts legs or trunk, there's probably some level of difficulty with their gait. They may use like crutches, a walker, or wheelchair, something like that. So is your center and your horses equipped to handle that? Have your horses been around wheelchairs and that kind of a thing? Hand in hand with walking might be difficulty with balance. So thinking standing on one leg, which is a requirement for a standard croup mount, right? If we all think about that in our heads. So maybe if the tone is really, really high in their hips and they can't spread their legs far enough, to get that leg up and over the croup, or maybe the person doesn't have enough strength to lift their leg against gravity up and over the croup, you might do a crest mount, which is a little bit easier. Do you have a lift? Maybe that's what it looks like. I would just recommend that you practice the mount and dismount before you transition to a live equine. So whether that be like on a pommel, if you have an equicizer, awesome. Shout out to equicizer. We love ours. A hay bale, whatever you have, just plan ahead for that, because we know as EAS professionals that the mount and dismount process is one of the most vulnerable times we are as far as safety in our session. There's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts for our horses and for us. So make sure that you're prepared for whatever scenario you might have during the mount. Um, a close cousin, I guess, of walking and balance would be motor planning. So, how our brain communicates with our body to make those really fine movements and plan ahead for how we're going to move our body to achieve things. If you have hypertonicity or hypotonicity, those muscles aren't sensing and responding with as much finesse as someone with typical muscle tone. So it may be difficult to get their body to do what they want it to do. They might very well understand the mount and dismount process. They may very well understand what you want them to do with their reins, but actually getting their muscles to do those things may be difficult for them. So just think about that in advance. Also, let's just think about sitting statically in the saddle. There's hundreds of postural adjustments that happen every minute almost to keep yourself upright. So those things might be tricky and they might require some extra troubleshooting on your part. Even thinking about what tack I'm going to use, what support from sidewalkers might I need, what kind of horse, right? So we know that sometimes a smoother horse is good for those who have postural and, kind of balance difficulties. We also know that sometimes increasing sensory feedback, so having a horse that moves a little bit more dynamically, can help improve that body awareness and help improve some of the just the sensory input and feedback to those muscles to help them kind of kick on and work the way they need to. So it may be kind of a process of troubleshooting, but really think about the things that you are able to control as the instructor or therapist and use those in your advantage. Another component for people, for those with high tone specifically, is stretching. So if that tone is more rigid, even, contractural a little bit, especially in hips and lower legs for hypertonia, doing some sitting on a barrel or a pommel or the equicizer again or whatever for 10 or 15 minutes before their lesson begins, it could help significantly improve their mobility. Could help improve that mount dismount process. A lot of times we have participants that get a little stuck or get rigid in those hip muscles. And so working on that hip extension can be really, really helpful for the mount and dismount process. So doing a little warm up there. If it's upper extremity and you're working on using reins, maybe there's some arm, flexion extension exercises that they could do beforehand, working on wrist and finger mobility. So stretching those fingers out so we can get their fingers around the reins, or whatever that is. Being, mindful of what we could do before we get on. In contrast to that, so remember that for hypotonia, hypermobility can be a secondary issue. Hypermobility meaning too much mobility. Remember, hyper means too much. So if they have too much mobility, we need to be really careful when moving in and out of different positions, especially during the mount, or if you're a therapist and you're doing some therapeutic positioning, maybe turning people around backwards or that kind of a thing. Because those joints are very flexible and there isn't adequate muscle support to that joint. So it could be really easy to just accidentally, we don't mean to, but injure those joints from over mobility if we're not paying very close attention to that, because they lack that strength, right? So they're not going to be able to bring that leg along, with us when we're turning around backwards or whatever, as well as say you or I could, because of that hypotonicity. So just be aware of that. What about bracing? We talked about how sometimes our participants with differences in tone may wear different types of braces. So it could be low or high tone, either one. But either way, it's going to impact our mobility in some way, obviously. So we talked a little bit earlier about AFOs, or ankle foot orthoses. It typically has a little hinge. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but comes a little ways. That orthosis will come a little ways up on the calf and connects under the foot. So it may be more rigid, like out of that plastic material, or you could have a softer style one that are more of like a stabilizer versus a true orthosis. But either way, it's adding extra kind of girth to that foot and leg area. So we want to take note of the sensitivity of your horse and make sure that that orthosis isn't pinching the horse. If it's a more rigid one, that can happen. Or make sure that your orthosis isn't accidentally tucked into the fender, of your Western saddle, or stuck under the strap of your English leather. I've seen both of those happen just by accident, kind of during the mount and dismount process. So make sure that you're double checking that to make sure that they're not stuck onto their saddle or any way, or that's rubbing a pressure sore for them or your horse. You may choose to use an alternative ankle hold for that person if they do have sidewalkers, just to prevent that rubbing, like an inside the ankle type of a hold. Just be conscious that we do have lack of mobility, right? So if you're harping on heels down, I feel like I have low level PTSD from my instructor yelling heels down when I was in lessons. Um, but remember that AFO is either preventing foot drop for individuals who have low tone, or it's preventing, most often, extension of the ankle in those who have high tone. So that AFO may be fixed pretty close to neutral. Some of them do hinge, quite a ways, and some of them are pretty fixed. So no matter how much you work on heels down, no matter how much you harp on them, if they're wearing an AFO for that reason, it's probably going to be pretty tricky to get them there. So remember that we need to evaluate what the participants' abilities are, especially when they're using medical equipment, so that we can either make accommodations or just assess the expectations that we have for those participants that may be wearing that kind of equipment. This episode is sponsored by Equiforce. Equiforce is a database that allows you to track every facet of your organization, from horse, donor, and volunteer management to scheduling, grant tracking, incident reports, and tracking participant progress too. This is not a one-size-fits-all setup. Instead, Equiforce personally works with you to learn how your facility functions and takes note of your specific terminology so that they can create a unique system to match the needs of your organization. And of course, Equiforce provides an ongoing training and support so that your database can grow with you. Visit them at www.equiforce.com. That's EQUI-FORCE.com. Lastly, I just want to touch on I think kind of the elephant in the room, right? So posture and position. Obviously, we're going to struggle with that proper ear, shoulder, hip, heel position that we all strive for as horsemen and women. Um, because the muscle tone is impacting just the position of the entire body, right? So we're going to see things like chair seat. When those knees come up, looks like we're sitting in a chair. Super slumped over, rounded shoulders, from that weak core, all common things that we might see from the side view. But what about from behind? So, participants who experience differences in tone may have difficulty staying centered in their saddle left to right. They may sit with one shoulder higher than the other or have a leg length discrepancy where one leg is longer than the other because of tone. And all of this stuff impacts our participants' success because without a functional position, it's really hard to use your arms and legs and your body the way we need to for horsemanship. Um, but not only that, it also greatly impacts our horses. And it's our jobs as instructors and therapists during mounted sessions to be advocating for our horses' comfort and their happiness. Because participants being out of position can make our horses' backs really sore. It can cause the horses to be off balance. It can cause a greater level of cognitive stress for them to carry someone that's that unbalanced. All those factors do contribute to burnout in our favorite coworkers, which is our horses, and that's not good. So it's our job to manage all of that stuff for them. And there are a million and one factors that go into posture and positional changes, the weight and height of our participants, their abilities to obtain a better position. There's different tools and strategies and things that we can do to encourage better positions. We can use adaptive tack. Um, what about, difficult conversations with our participants when mounted activity is no longer safe? We can't find a really great safe position for them. I would honestly need a whole nother hour to address all of these things, which is why Edie is going to do it for me. So, Edie is our fearless leader, the HETRA CEO, and an amazing occupational therapist. She's been at this for over 30 years and has so much information to share. She did an entire hour on postural corrections and modifications. And it was absolutely phenomenal. She did the presentation at our most recent HETRA University Live conference, and people were blown away. Like, she has so many good practical tips that you can start using tomorrow to help improve participant position. So, if you're listening to this prior to November 17th of 2024, please join us for the live version. She's going to do postural corrections and modifications live via Zoom. And she's going to use our trusty partner, the Equicizer, to demonstrate different strategies and tactics that you can use for participants who struggle. So if you have participants who have differences in muscle tone and you're like, I just can't get them, centered, or I can't get them in a good leg position, or whatever it is. Edie's going to troubleshoot all of that stuff for us for a whole hour. So it's going to be great. The best thing about all of this is that it is eligible for one disability education CEU, and it's only $10. $10, that's it, unless you are a Patreon member. If you are a Patreon member of our community over there, then it's for free. That's right, for free. Um, and the funny thing about that is that the subscription is only $5 per month and the webinar is $10. So make that make sense. You're getting it for free. Anyway, if you're listening at a later date, so after November, go over to hetrauniversity.org and catch it on demand. We have a whole catalog of webinars over there, and I will eventually get Edie's presentation posted onto that on-demand catalog. So you won't get to experience the whole dynamic presentation and ask whatever questions you want and yada yada, but you will still get all the good information. So still a really good option. Okay. I hope y'all learned something today about muscle tone. Yes, it can be complicated, but it does not have to be. It's so important that we arm ourselves with the basic knowledge of these different symptoms and diagnoses and things so that we can help our participants be safe and successful, because the bottom line is that, yes, we're teaching horsemanship, but we're also teaching horsemanship to participants with differing ability levels, and they might have high or low muscle tone. And so how do we help them just be the best they can be? I appreciate each and every one of you for tuning in today. Don't forget to scroll down to the show notes, get the details, get registered for Edie's webinar on postural corrections, November 17th, or click the link for the on-demand catalog. I'll also put the Patreon information there, because remember, those folks are getting the postural webinar for free, and they are also getting the comprehensive list of disability education episodes that we have done so far on the show. So I hope to see you either on the live webinar or over in our Patreon community, and I hope everyone has a great day.
That's all for today, but until the next episode launches, scroll down to the show notes and click on the link to get plugged in with us on Facebook, Instagram, or our exclusive educational club at Patreon. This podcast is presented by HETRA University, the educational arm of Heartland Equine Therapeutic Riding Academy in Gretna, Nebraska. HETRA University's mission is to provide high-quality educational offerings to the EAS community. Check out all the HETRA University has to offer at www.hetrauniversity.org.